European allies are whether our American experiment will ultimately prove successful. Remember, it is the American experiment. It is not the American proven theorem. Whether it succeeds, well, that's up to us. Thanks for spending your Sunday morning with us. The news continues next.
This is GPS, the Global Public Square. Welcome to all of you in the United States and around the world. I'm Fareed Zakaria, coming to you live from New York. Today on the program, the Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade. What are the legal and political implications of this ruling? And when it comes to abortion access, is America exceptional? We will look at reproductive rights, all that with two top journalists. Then, President Biden is in Germany today for the meeting of the G7. Will the world's advanced economies ramp up pressure on Russia? Will it work? And Israel's government collapses. What does that mean for the country, the region, and for Bibi Netanyahu? Richard Haass and Gideon Rachman weigh in. Finally, a seismic shift in French politics. President Macron's centrist party loses its parliamentary majority. Both the far right and left make electoral gains. Why is this happening? And just who are these voters embracing the extremes? But first, here's my take. American democracy has been under stress for some time now. Trust in its institutions is near the lowest on record. And when we say this, we usually mean Congress and the presidency. But the Supreme Court's decision on Roe v. Wade has brought the public's confidence in the court to an all-time low and puts it in the same category as the others, defined by partisanship and polarization. The court's decisions this week are not conservative. They are radical. One of the time-honored conservative doctrines has been a respect for precedent, stare decisis. And yet in 2 days, the court swept aside a right that for half a century American jurisprudence had held was a constitutional right. And it also uprooted a New York law regulating guns that was 111 years old and had never before been found in conflict with the Constitution. Many of the justices were asked in their nomination hearings about Roe v. Wade and stare decisis, and they answered in a way that any plain observer would describe as declaring that the precedent of Roe and many rulings affirming it should be respected. It's worth noting that the power of judicial review, by which the Supreme Court evaluates laws and strikes down those it deems unconstitutional, is itself nowhere in the Constitution, was created by an 1803 ruling from Chief Justice John Marshall and is respected by all three branches of government, well, because of stare decisis. We'll talk more about Roe in a moment, so let me explain why the court's other decision on guns is actually equally radical. The Second Amendment is in its entirety 27 words with 3 oddly placed commas. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. As I've said before, no disrespect to James Madison, but grammarians and their red pens would have a field day with the sentence. No one is exactly sure what the first clause about the militia has to do with the clause about the right to bear arms. For almost 200 years, however, the lack of clarity was barely an issue. Many states had what we would today regard as very strong gun control laws, and they passed muster with all sorts of courts. But then in the 1970s, new leadership took over the NRA and made it the group's mission to protect every citizen's individual right, supposedly enshrined in the Second Amendment, to keep and bear arms. This caused former Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Warren Burger, a conservative jurist appointed by Richard Nixon, to say the following on PBS in 1991.
This has been the subject of one of the greatest pieces of fraud, I repeat the word fraud, on the American public by special interest groups that I have ever seen in my lifetime.
217 years after the ratification of the Second Amendment, Justice Antonin Scalia and his colleagues on the Supreme Court discovered in the Heller decision an individual right to bear and carry arms, treating the first clause of the Second Amendment as if it were totally inconsequential. In fact, the founders knew exactly what well-regulated militias meant, as the scholar Michael Waldman told me.
You had an individual right to gun ownership to fulfill your duty to serve in the militia. Every adult white man was required by law to serve in the militia and required to own a military weapon and keep it at home.
The latest Supreme Court ruling striking down a New York law that restricted who can carry a concealed handgun in public is even more radical than Heller. As George Will, the conservative columnist, explains, the oldest legal tradition has been to balance an individual's right with the state's concerns for public safety. For example, the court stated in 1919 that your right to free speech does not allow you to yell fire in a crowded theater. This Supreme Court seems less and less impartial and judicious and more nakedly political, which undermines trust in a great American institution that was once respected but has been losing that respect in recent years. We know that January 6th was a terrible day for American democracy. Sadly, we now have to add 2 more days, June 23rd and 24th, to that calendar of shame. And let's get started. This weekend, American women woke up to a country remade. 50 years of constitutional abortion rights gone overnight. At least 10 states effectively banned abortion since Friday's decision, and women with procedures scheduled found their appointments canceled. An additional 16 states have laws that indicate they could outlaw or set pretty sharp limits on abortions, according to the Guttmacher Institute. All over the country, protesters flooded the streets to demonstrate against the court decision overturning Roe v. Wade. But the fight in the streets is only the beginning. Courts will almost certainly be flooded with challenges to bans in the coming months and years. To talk more about the Supreme Court decision and what it might mean for the country, I'm joined by Emily Bazelon, staff writer at the New York Times Legal Magazine, who writes often and brilliantly about legal affairs. Emily, welcome. I want to start by asking if you can frame this this decision in terms of history. How often does the Supreme Court, take back a constitutional right that it has granted and granted for 2 generations?
Not often at all. I really can't think of a precedent for rolling back an individual civil right that people, especially women, have depended on for 5 decades. The court changes its mind on occasion, but not in this direction. We usually see the court trying to expand people's rights over time, and this is a direction that is entirely the opposite from the point of view of women especially, and people generally.
And what I'm struck by is the method of reasoning, and the dissents point this out. So when you look at a ruling like Plessy versus Ferguson, which allowed for segregation, when Brown versus Board of Education overturned that and said, we made a mistake, what it cited was decades of social science evidence that showed that the contention in Plessy versus Ferguson, which was that separate is equal, was not true in education in particular. That having separate education for blacks and whites was inherently unequal. So they were citing facts on the ground that had changed. This ruling doesn't do any of that, right?
Right. I mean, we're really going in the opposite direction. So in this case, we have more and more evidence that abortion is safe and effective and crucial for women's advancements in society. There is really good social science. And so the court claimed a comparison between overturning Roe and overturning Plessy. But in fact, if you're thinking about evidence and if you're thinking about people's individual rights, those decisions are diametrically opposite in their effect.
So what do you think this tells us about the court going forward? There was an article in the New York Times that said, what this means is that John Roberts has become the most inconsequential Chief Justice in a long time because he has no moderating power. He tried to find a way to split the difference, to find a kind of compromise. And now that there is this solid conservative majority, he's kind of irrelevant.
That's exactly right. He has been sidelined along with his moderating impulses. And what we see here are 5 conservative justices that are really determined to change the law in a way that is going to affect Americans' lives directly. You talked about the decision from New York, which makes it harder for states and localities to control their own gun safety laws. And now we have this huge upending of reproductive rights across the country. So you really see a court that is willing to maximally use its power in a conservative direction. And the question will be, you know, what the American people decide to do about that over time.
Clarence Thomas says that the court now, this is one justice and was not joined by others, says that the natural consequence of overturning Roe would be to rethink gay marriage, to rethink access to contraception, or, you know, all that kind of thing, because in a sense it all came out of the same idea that there was a right to privacy, famously described by Blackmun as existing within the penumbras of the Constitution.
Right. So all of these decisions rely on an interpretation of the 14th Amendment that's based on privacy and a conception of liberty. And this conservative majority does not buy into that thinking. So for the moment, Justice Thomas is the only justice saying out loud that these other decisions, same-sex marriage, contraception, are also called into question. But it's entirely possible there is more support for that on the court. And I think that while, you know, the court would say that public opinion and public response is not relevant to its considerations, we know over history that that's not true. And so how far the court goes really will be, at least in part, a response to the way Americans respond to this decision overturning Roe and the signals the political system sends to the court about what people are willing to tolerate when the court seems to really move far away from American popular opinion.
Emily, always a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much. Next on GPS, from abortion rights at home to abortion rights around the world. How did the U.S. under Roe compare to other countries, and how does it compare now? That's when we come back.
Blueprint, in association with Qatar Airways.
The contents of this bottle may be helping airlines reduce their carbon footprint. It's called SAF, or Sustainable Aviation Fuel, a type of biofuel primarily from waste and residues like used cooking oil. Neste, a Finnish oil refinery, has been manufacturing SAF for more than 10 years. Neste says they clean the oil by placing it in a biorefinery to remove impurities. As of now, most planes are not yet ready to operate fully on biofuel.
It has to be blended with fossil product when it's going into the aircraft. But SAF one day will be completely replacing fossil.
SAF has helped power more than 370,000 commercial flights since 2016, a significant step towards the industry's goal of net zero emissions by 2050.
Blueprint, in association with Qatar Airways.
The world's biggest business stories in one place. Expert analysis from every corner of the globe. Marketplace, Africa, Asia, Europe, and Middle East. With CNNBusiness.com.
Once in a generation opportunity.
Technology, innovation, business.
Have you heard it like this?
Let's untangle the players and political forces.
Fast-paced news from the perspective of The Global Brief with Bianca Nobilo. Weeknights on CNN.
Connect the World with Becky Anderson.
It all starts here. Changing, fighting, creating, connecting. That's why we're here. We live here, we work here, we're from here, and we'll go wherever the story takes us.
I'm Becky Anderson in Tehran. We are in Jerusalem.
Real news that shapes our world. Exploring not just what's going on, but why.
I just want to press you on one further point.
Getting perspective on this region from this region. Places that many of us know, but few of us get to see. Observing countries on the move, still rooted in tradition. It all starts here, and that's why we're here, bringing you the world from our Middle Eastern hub.
Connect the World with Becky Anderson, Monday through Friday on CNN.
These troops, they are Russian. I've spoken to the commander. He said they are now in control. Over that way. It's a secret location. They're going to fire on Russian forces. There has been a ferocious battle here. There's unexploded grenades everywhere. We're being shown the powerful American guns, giving them an edge.
You downplayed the US intelligence assessment. Do you now regret that?
I'm in Kiev right now, and it is under attack, Mr. Lavrov, from Russian forces.
I'm being told by our security that we need to get our flak jackets on.
No matter where you are in this country, lives are being shattered.
There are thousands streaming out. It is at least a chance to save their own lives. Matthew Chance, CNN.
In the majority opinion that overturned Roe v. Wade, Justice Samuel Alito repeated a claim that is often invoked by anti-abortion activists. The claim is that under Roe, the U.S. is a global outlier, more permissive than most other countries in its abortion law. Is that true, and does that assertion tell us the whole story of abortion rights in America and around the world? My next guest is Margot Sanger-Katz, a reporter at the New York Times who covers health. First, Margot, let's get the facts on the table. It is true, as far as I know, that the U.S. is a rare country where abortion is a constitutional right. I think in no European country is it given that level of protection. And it is also true that the United States allows abortions up to about 24 weeks, which is a longer time period than most countries. Fair or not fair? Give us a sense of the outline.
Well, I think that would have been fair as of a couple of days ago, but because of this new Supreme Court decision, we no longer have a constitutional right to abortion in the United States. And so these decisions about when abortions will be allowed have been left to state legislatures, potentially to Congress. And I think that does make it a lot more like how abortion is governed in many other countries of the world. There are some countries where the courts have gotten involved and there have been constitutional rulings about reproductive rights. But for many countries, especially in Europe, these have really been legislative matters, and we've seen countries decide, with their parliaments what they want their abortion laws to be. I do think sort of technically it is correct that the United States was unusual in having a very expansive abortion right prior to this decision. But I think in practice it's a little bit more complicated. A lot of countries in Europe have laws that say that you can have an abortion for any reason up to about 12 or 14 weeks of pregnancy. But then after that, you can get an abortion if you have a reason, like a health reason or a socioeconomic reason. These reasons differ by country, of course. But on the ground, in real life, in many of these countries, it was in fact easier to get an abortion later in pregnancy than it was in some parts of the United States. And of course, that contrast now has become much more sharp.
And it's fair to say that the overwhelming majority of pregnancies, you tell me the percentage, happen pretty early on. They don't happen in week 22, 23.
That's right. Even in the United States, when abortion was technically legal up until the point of fetal viability, it's about 23 weeks of pregnancy, the vast majority, like 95% or more of abortions were taking place before that point. More than 90% of abortions in the United States happen in the first trimester of pregnancy.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously said about Roe, which she supported, but she said it did have this bad effect, which was that it stopped the democratic process from finding compromises. And you could see that in Europe, where these decisions have been made by democratic legislatures, that they come up with these compromises which are, more in the center than the United States is at 14 weeks or 12. Germany is 12 weeks, I think, but as you say, after that with reasons. Is it possible that we will come to some kind of centrist, moderate compromise in the United States?
I think it's certainly possible, but that's not at all what it looks like right now. I think what we see in the United States right now is that some states are very comfortable with the kind of abortion rights that we've had for the last 50 years under Roe and are looking to cement that right and perhaps expand it to help people who want to come in from other states. And then, of course, there are about half of states in the United States that are really looking to ban abortion almost entirely. These laws that are going into effect, several of which have already kicked in the last few days, ban all abortions except in very rare exceptions. And in that way, they are very different from what we see in the rest of the world. Those kinds of laws exist in the minority of countries of the world, and the long-term trend has been towards liberalizing abortion law, not tightening them.
But that's very interesting what you say, that what we will end up in this country is two completely different sets of states. Some that have laws that are almost, in a sense, enacting Roe, and some which will have extreme bans on abortion. So the American average may end up at something like 12 or 14 weeks, but that will be because you have two completely different countries, one that has abortion laws that resemble more, Nigeria or something, and the other side which has laws that resemble the most liberal European country.
And of course, women can travel in the United States from state to state, and we've already seen that there are states even before this decision where it was hard to get an abortion and where women wanted to go someplace where it was a little bit easier to schedule an appointment. But of course, not everyone is going to be able to do that, and we do anticipate that the number of abortions is likely to decline as a result of these very strict state laws, and particularly because the states that are looking to limit abortion are kind of geographically clustered, and so that makes it much harder for a woman to travel. It's not just in many cases that she would have to go to a neighboring state, but that she might have to travel hundreds and hundreds of miles to reach a state where an abortion is legal.
Now, there is a hope that many Democrats have that this will galvanize Democrats, suburban moms and things like that. But it seems to me that the key is for the Democrats not to come across as equally extreme, that the country is somewhere in the middle. 70% are in favor of pro-choice position, but they all grapple with where to set that limit. Does it seem to you that, I look at Chuck Schumer's proposal that abortions be allowed for even longer than Roe? Is the looking at other countries, does success come if you can present yourself as understanding that there's a need for compromise, or is it better to go hard and get your constituent?
I think it's hard to know because obviously the political and legal history of these other countries is different, but it is certainly the case that the kind of laws that we see in Europe, which say you can have an abortion for any reason early in pregnancy, and then later in pregnancy, if there's a health reason, if you have some severe socioeconomic problem or something like that, that's where we really see American public opinion in general. You see about 2/3 of Americans, and this has been very stable for many decades, about 2/3 of Americans support abortion in those kinds of circumstances. They want there to be some kind of right to abortion, but they are, in many cases, uncomfortable with very expansive abortion rights that allow abortion for any reason until very late in pregnancy. And it's just very hard to see in our current polarized environment how the United States gets to a political reality, to a legal reality that reflects that kind of compromise consensus view that we see in other countries and that we also see in the American public at large.
Such a great point. How to reflect the majority of the country, the plurality of the country that is in the center and moderate on a lot of these issues. Margot, that was terrific. Thank you so much. We got to go. Next up, foreign policy panel about all kinds of things. Russia, Ukraine, Israel, Saudi Arabia, when we come back.
Mainland China tolerates no signs of dissent whatsoever.
Are you anticipating dozens of people being prosecuted? Hundreds? Thousands?
We're flying over ISIS front lines. This is the only protection we have. Nerves are still very much on edge. Firefighters have been battling this blaze for weeks. This is unfolding in front of our eyes.
Ivan Watson, CNN.
My school has been involved in human trafficking awareness and taking action against human trafficking for about 13 years. My name is Veronica McDaniel, and I am teacher supervisor of Atlanta International School Against Human Trafficking. I feel it's important to teach young people to know the signs of human trafficking. We can do a lot of prevention work just by opening their eyes to the problem. Hashtag My Freedom Day means a lot to me. It actually fuels my work with young people at Atlanta International School and globally. 6 years running, we've been able to really reach a lot of students. It's just become bigger than I think any of us really thought it would, and now we want it to keep getting even bigger. My hope for the future is that students are becoming so much more confident in this topic that they're completely leading the charge, where students are listening to other students, and we're realizing that's the most effective way for kids to really hear about the issue. I'm an idealist. I know that we can't completely eradicate human trafficking in the next 5 years, but my hope is that over time, with this new wave of strong young leaders, that we're certainly diminishing.
I'm Jim Bitterman in Paris, and this is CNN.
You can help the refugees from Ukraine. Join the over 80,000 who've already raised millions for food, shelter, and more. Explore CNN.com/impact. Click to take action.
Business is all about making connections. But some connections are easier to make than others. With a CNN Partner Hotel, the world is always at your fingertips. CNN Partner Hotels, connected to your world.
I'm Linda Kincaid in Atlanta, and this is CNN.
President Biden is in Germany today for the meeting of the G7, and what to do about Russia is on top of the agenda. I'm joined now by Richard Haass, who is the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, and Gideon Rachman, who is the FT's chief foreign affairs columnist and the author of The Age of the Strongmen, terrific book. He joins me from London. Gideon, let me put to you a proposition that I've been wondering about, which is the economic sanctions strategy against Vladimir Putin is not working and is not likely to work. As long as you have this huge exception for energy, Russia is basically the first or second largest energy exporter in the world, Putin is getting more and more cash from that because prices are high, because of the crisis, because of curtailments of supply. So while his production may have gone down 20%, say, the prices are up 40%. He makes out. And there isn't an easy solution to this because you can't embargo the oil. The West, the whole world would go into a sharp recession. And the more you squeeze it, actually, the less supply there is and the prices go even higher. So is this economic sanction misconceived, or am I getting it wrong?
Well, I think you've certainly put your finger on the major flaw in the strategy. I don't think you should be too gloomy. There will be effects. There are effects on the Russian economy. You know, people expect it to shrink by up to 10% this year, and there are some things they're going to find very hard to get around. For example, restrictions on semiconductor imports, which may in time actually affect their ability to produce weaponry and so on. But you're right. They are currently getting something like $1 billion a day in revenues from oil and gas exports. And the Europeans, far from being in a position to cut them off, they're going to try that with oil. But gas, you're looking at a dependency that it may take 3 years, and that's being optimistic, to get rid of. And meanwhile, the Russians actually turning the pressure back on the Europeans by threatening to turn off the gas tap in time for winter, which could cause the Europeans to have to do energy rationing in countries such as Germany and Italy. So, yeah, we can damage the Russians, but we're also learning that the Russians can damage us.
And one quick point on that. I mean, you've written the book, The Age of Strongmen. Putin is not likely to be particularly moved by the plight of ordinary Russians if he's getting, by the barrelful, all this energy revenue, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the political situations that the two sides have to deal with are very different. Putin is in a position to crush any dissent. Thousands of people were arrested for demonstrating against the war. So even if the Russian economy goes into a deep spiral downwards, there's not going to be, a direct effect on Putin. Whereas if you're a Western politician and you're looking at soaring inflation, possible energy rationing, you immediately have to start worrying about the next election. And so there is a kind of asymmetry there.
Richard, if you agree with this analysis, let me ask you another way of getting at this is, the economic strategy is not working. How to make the military strategy work? Because even there, the Russians are in this very brutal way gaining ground. Since the goal is to bring Putin to the negotiating table, he doesn't want to do it now. He doesn't see that he's losing. How to change that dynamic on the battlefield?
Well, I'm not sure, Fareed, you can change the dynamic to bring Putin to the negotiating table. If he's winning, he's going to want to continue. And if he's losing, he'll never accept defeat. He will basically hang tough until he believes things will move in his favor. So I think what we need to do, and by we I mean the West, is gear ourselves for a long war. We need to be providing Ukraine with more quantity and quality than we are. Over time, the Russians may run short of munitions. That's where some parts of the sanctions could have some bite. So essentially, we need to do what we're doing, just do more of it faster.
And Richard, do you think that there is a way to, I've raised this often, and Admiral Jim Stavridis agrees with me, find a way to escort Ukrainian ships out of Odessa? This is where most of their exports leave the country. Ukraine's economy, which seems to be contracting 45% this year, is in free fall unless it can export particularly grain, but really everything out of Odessa.
Well, you're right, and the grain matters not just to Ukraine as an export, but it matters to a big chunk of Africa and the Middle East as an import. And we could see considerable instability, food riots, or worse, around the world. The idea of organizing some type of a flotilla, the model is in the late 1980s when Kuwaiti tankers were escorted by the United States in the context of the Iran-Iraq war. That's a possibility. We'd have to get Turkey on board, given its unique position in the Black Sea. We'd have to get the countries, I think, that import grain involved, the Egypts of the world. We wouldn't want it to simply be an American or a NATO effort. I think it's a long shot for Reed. I think it would be a bold step. Up to now, we've obviously avoided any type of direct military involvement. So I'm not saying we should rule it out, but one, I think it's risky. And two, I think it's a long shot that we'd be able to organize it. So we may need to think about imperfect approaches, for example, importing as much as, or exporting rather, as much as we can of Ukrainian grain out through places like Romania. Like I said, it's a second best outcome, but it's less risky and it might be something more within our control.
Stay with me. When we come back, I want to pivot to the Middle East. Israel has perhaps the most unstable government in the world, and it now has a new prime minister. There may be elections soon. What is going to happen there, and more on the Middle East when we come back.
So many questions about what is the federal government doing. Do you get the anger that is out here?
How concerned are you about the front line?
You don't believe that there's a racial divide here?
Looking back, as president, did you tell the story of race in America enough, do you think?
All the places I've been and all the things I've seen, all the people I've talked to, I carry with me. They're a part of what I do right here, holding the powerful accountable, keeping them honest.
AC 360, Tuesday through Saturday only on CNN.
Potato custodians are basically the guardians of the traditional knowledge, and they're also the guardians of the diversity itself.
There are about 4,000 varieties of native potato in the world, and most of them are grown in the Andes, while only a handful are available in supermarkets around the world.
Between the two of us, we have been growing these seeds for 20 years, preserving them since the day of our wedding. My mother told me, now I want to teach my daughters.
It's a laboratory that's not managed by scientists, but it's a laboratory that is basically more than 10,000 years of evolution in the hands of farmers.
I can't let them be forgotten, because all the flavors, I know now how to grow them, and in that way I can keep the varieties alive.
I'm Andrea Vena. I'm the Chief Climate and Sustainability Officer at the European Space Agency. The great responsibility that ESA has to be responsible is linked very much to the fact that since decades our programs are contributing to the understanding of climate change. Our satellites are contributing to the climate variables that are used by scholars and scientists all over the world to identify what are the hotspots for climate change. Therefore, we feel accountable. We know what is the situation, and therefore it is very much important for ESA to be on the leading edge for fighting against climate change.
And we are back with Richard Haass and Gideon Rachman. Richard, I want to ask your reaction to the Israeli government collapsing, or however you want to describe it. Was this inevitable, and what do you think comes of it?
It was inevitable. This was a 8-party coalition that really bridged the entire political spectrum. The one thing they had in common, Fareed, is they were against the previous prime minister, Bibi Netanyahu. But governing was always going to be difficult. Some might say it's amazing they lasted as long as they lasted. Anyhow, Israel's going back to its 5th election in as many years. My guess is Bibi Netanyahu's party, Likud, will get a plurality, but never in Israeli history has any party gotten the majority. So first, he will have the challenge of putting together a government. That will be extremely difficult. And even if he were to succeed, he'd have real problems getting a government that could govern. So I think Israel essentially is stuck with a political system and a society that is so divided that it can't essentially get out of its own way to produce a working majority.
Gideon Rachman, Israel is also one of those countries that has famously not really condemned the Russian aggression in Ukraine and is not being particularly helpful to Ukraine. Ukraine's president called them out on it. Could any of that change?
I think unlikely, to be honest. I think Netanyahu, if he does make it back as prime minister, is somebody who actually prided himself on having a good relationship with Vladimir Putin. The Israelis say they need to work with the Russians to some extent because the Russians are so present in Syria. They say they're effectively Israel's next door neighbor. And they probably know that there's a limit to which any American government is going to go in punishing Israel for not following the guidelines of US foreign policy. So I think they're going to walk this tightrope for a while. They're going to, not obviously endorse what Russia's done, but I think they're going to try and preserve a relationship with the Russians at the same time.
And Biden is, you're looking at the region. Biden is going to Saudi Arabia. We all understand why. He wants them to pump more oil. But the Saudis are going to be asked for something very tough on Iran, I imagine. Richard, can the United States find a way to both deal with the Iranian nuclear issue in the way that Biden and the Obama administration tried, which was some kind of a deal, and placate Saudi Arabia? Or are those two just contradictory goals?
Ultimately, they're contradictory because even if we were able to get back into the agreement with the Iranians, it would simply buy a little bit of time on the nuclear side. It wouldn't buy you anything on the missile side. It wouldn't buy you anything on the regional destabilization side. That said, I think the odds of getting back into it are long. So I think this becomes part of the new axis in the Middle East, Fareed. And you and I are of a generation where so much of the Middle East was along the Israeli-Palestinian divide, then along the Iraqi divide. Well, now it's along the Iranian divide. And no matter who's the prime minister of Israel, including Bibi Netanyahu, there is consensus on one thing, a hard line towards Iran. So I think Israel and Saudi Arabia share that. And the real question is, will the Biden administration that wants to pivot to Asia, that's obviously heavily involved in Europe, as we were just discussing, whether it has the appetite and the bandwidth to also take a tough line towards Iran? This could be the big foreign policy test of this administration before all else is done.
Gideon Rachman, when you watch the G7, the images coming out, is there something you think that they should be talking about that they're not? What do you think what do you think should happen here?
Well, I mean, I think it's pretty inevitable that they'll be very much focused on Ukraine, and I think that is probably the correct call. But obviously, that can crowd out other stuff. And, as Richard was saying, you could have a crisis in Iran soon. And I think that America has this perpetual problem of knowing that China is the big long-term challenge for the United States, but constantly finding its attention dragged away, during the Obama years to the Middle East, now during the Biden years towards Ukraine, in the Trump years towards North Korea. So maintaining this focus on the long-term strategic challenge of China is a big issue. And I think you're going to actually see more of that at the next summit, the NATO summit, where, interestingly, they've invited some major Asian powers to attend: Japan, South Korea, Australia. And I think that indicates that NATO is now looking not just at Russia, but also increasingly at the challenge of China.
Richard, I've got about 30 seconds. If you had a magic wand and you wanted these leaders, either at the G7 or NATO, to do something big, what would it be?
Do something about natural gas. That is the key to Russia's economic strength. Limit natural gas imports from Russia, obviously accelerate the military tools, but I don't think there's a game changer, Fareed. This is a long war. We've got to gear ourselves for that and avoid, if you will, fatigue.
I assume, and what you mean by that is also encourage American natural gas. And the United States is the Saudi Arabia of natural gas and could export a lot of it to Europe and the world, obviously, in liquefied form. Richard Haass, Gideon Rachman, thank you so much. As always, such a pleasure. Next on GPS, the far right and left made surprising gains in France's legislative elections this week. Who are these people voting, particularly for the far right? We will explore this with Sophie Pedro of The Economist when we come back.
Egypt is diversifying its energy mix and extending its pioneering strategy to every part of the country. Through working in partnerships, Egypt aims to provide 42% of its electricity from renewable energy by 2035. The country is successfully transitioning to more sustainable sources, creating green jobs, and powering a more sustainable future.
I'm Nick Watt in Los Angeles, and this is CNN.
This is a really important story. My name's Clarissa Ward. I work for CNN. Assalamu alaikum. Day in, day out. You see the reality of people living through this. Ничего страшного. Okay. This is the front line. On a human level, you find courage, sacrifice. This is what life is about. A lot of people are wondering why. You see the worst of humanity.
Putin might use a nuclear weapon. Absolutely terrifying.
But you also see the best of humanity. My job is to be present. The human cost is right here. And to tell these stories.
We're talking about families.
That is the most important thing. I'm Clarissa Ward in Ukraine. This is CNN.
So much of business travel now is mixed with leisure. People are working from abroad. But yes, certainly the consulting trips, the Monday through Thursday, they are back and happening. Consultants are back on the road, engineers who need to do those factory visits, people in sales. So it's not quite off a cliff like people thought. But I think especially once that testing requirement is lifted and, I think businesses will feel more comfortable sending people out. But it will come back, but it'll just look a little bit different than what it used to. Whenever that testing requirement's lifted, we're going to see a shoot up in demand, especially international. And we're projecting at the Point Sky that airfare is going to continue rising steadily into June. It might taper off, but, we'll see. But in general, booking last minute is not a smart bet in 2022.
I'm Julia Chatterley, host of CNN's First Move. I'll speak to newsmakers, risk takers, and the ultimate game changers. Make CNN your first move.
First Move with Julia Chatterley, weekdays.
I'm Wolf Blitzer. This is CNN.
In the United States, it's not unusual for the president to govern with an adversarial House or Senate. In France, on the other hand, a sitting president has not lost a parliamentary majority for over 3 decades. That is, until this week, when French voters denied President Emmanuel Macron's centrist Ensemble bloc an absolute majority in the country's legislative elections. Macron will now have to govern through negotiation and compromise with both sides of the aisle. Marine Le Pen's far-right National Rally Party scored a historic success in this election, and on the left, Jean-Luc Mélenchon's new coalition gained ground as well. So why is this happening? And just who are these voters embracing the extremes? Sophie Petter joins me from Paris, where she is the bureau chief for The Economist. Sophie Petter, pleasure to have you on.
It's good to join you, Fareed.
Tell us what this means. What's the broader significance? Is this one more case of incumbency being unpopular, of people railing against the establishment in times that seem turbulent with inflation and war and all that kind of thing?
I think that's part of the answer. And certainly if you think back to the presidential election in France in April, don't forget that Emmanuel Macron, he was re-elected, but it was a narrow margin over his rival Marine Le Pen on the far right. And the fact that she got a better score this time than when he beat her in 2017 already tells you that there's a sense of sort of anti-establishment anger still out there in France. And that hasn't gone away. So I think in that respect, yes, this is what this is about. But I think it's more than that, Fareed. I think that what you're looking at is a very particular system in France, which hands strong powers to the presidency under the Fifth Republic Constitution. And that's the way Charles de Gaulle devised it back in 1958. But in doing so, I think that what the French were trying to do was put some kind of brake on the way in which Emmanuel Macron exercises power. He makes full use of that. And I think what the French are trying to do by handing him a parliament in which it's fragmented, there are extremes on the left and on the right, they're trying to curb the way he exercises power and force him in some ways to govern differently, to take a more inclusive approach to government.
The most surprising result, to me at least, was the dramatic surge in Marine Le Pen's, the far-right, the nationalist vote. It's up dramatically even from 2017. Did anyone predict that, and what do you think that's about?
No, I mean, the polls didn't predict that at all. It's extraordinary. She's got 89 deputies, and you could see them coming into Parliament this week. It's an 11-fold increase on 2017, and actually it's the highest that her party has ever held in Parliament. She has done a lot to try and kind of clean up her party's act. She has tried to make it more moderate. She has, in a way, I think there's been a sort of normalization of some of the more kind of xenophobic, anti-immigrant discourse in France, but she's also moderated that a little bit with a program that has been really focused on cost of living issues.
Another thing that struck me about her support is that she gets it, and this was true even in the presidential election, she gets a lot of support from young voters. In fact, it's a bit of the opposite of what happens in America and Britain, where in France, Macron was saved by people who were over 50, that young voters were disproportionately more likely to vote for the far right. What explains that, do you think?
That is true. I mean, the one thing I would say about this parliamentary election is that the young didn't vote at all. I mean, there are very few of them. There was a 70% abstention rate amongst young voters, which is pretty shocking statistic. That said, of those who did vote, yes, the young voted for Marine Le Pen. I mean, part of that is, I think, that she has exactly the sort of shift in her program. I'm not convinced that this is an anti-immigration vote. I think it's because they see her as someone who, she had promised, for example, that anyone under the age of 30 wouldn't pay income tax. I mean, she has been she's been very careful to look after the sort of social side of the worries that young voters have. So I think, yes, it's something that, certainly for Emmanuel Macron, who is increasingly relying on the older voter, it's something for him to think about very seriously.
And finally, Putin. Marine Le Pen had fairly direct ties to Putin and the Russians. She had received loans from Russian, essentially government entities. That didn't seem to hurt her at the polls at all.
I mean, the war in Ukraine clearly has been debated a lot in France, but it didn't damage her, and partly